Maturation in Infancy and Early Childhood by Michael Fordham. Introduction. The great discovery of Jung and his followers was the inner world of man depicted in myth, legend, art, literature, and religious practices. The term inner world is somewhat misleading, for as it has been experienced, it was more often external to the human being. In the sky, the earth, the oceans, the groves, in heaven, in hell, and so on. For this reason, Jung coined the term objective psyche to indicate its geographical characteristics and its separation from man as he knows himself. The term inner world is, however, still useful in emphasizing that the imagery and myths derive from man himself and can be experienced as part of the self in dreams and imagination, amongst other more primitive forms of experience. The documentation of inner objects and archetypes has reached mammoth proportions. Here, however, I want to say something about the activity of archetypes in individual development. At first, it was thought that the best time to study the objective inner world was in the second half of life, following Jung, whose emotional realization of it took place in later life. Today it can be shown that younger people also provide evidence of an inner world inhabited by archetypal forms. In this context, I would like to remark that Jung once said to me that the psychology of the unconscious, now symbols of transformation, was an account of adolescent psychology. It was only with great trepidation that archetypal imagery could be looked for in childhood. The archetypes were thought to be of great danger to children, until I showed in 1944 that they were not, and would seem to operate in the same compensatory way already observed in adult life. In the end, I gained more courage from Jung, who showed in his seminars on children's dreams that archetypal imagery could be found in them. Thus, there gradually grew up a substantial evidence that a child had an inner world just as much as an adult. Besides myself, Jung and a number of others confirmed my findings and made use of them. Amongst them was Frida Fordham. She contributed by showing that a child archetype referred to much of the emotional life of real children and infants, as well as to the inner child in adult patients. She drew mostly on the child myths recorded by Karenyi, in which the ruthlessness and violence of the child is so graphically brought out. That was also a finding of Melanie Klein about small children, and it is striking that she adopted Susan Isaac's notion of unconscious fantasy, which is defined in terms identical with archetypes as Jungians know them. In the 1930s, when I was working with children at the London Child Guidance Clinic, I was very much in the grip of the Jungian idea that disorders of childhood were caused by unconscious conflicts in and wrong attitudes of parents. So it was with surprise that I find that children's neurosis, behavior disorders, and even psychotic-like manifestations were evident and could be treated psychotherapeutically without changes in parents, which Jungian theory claimed would be necessary. That made me begin to think that a child was not a passive agent in family life, but was in some sense a separate being. My conclusion was supported by the contention that children develop neurotic conflicts during development in any case. At that time, there was much discussion about how young children could be treated and whether a child of 2 or 3 years could benefit from analysis. It is therefore with delight that I found a 2-year-old suffering from alarming fits, which were said to be epileptic and were being treated with luminal. Since her mother was remarkably stable and resourceful, I did not treat her, but let her sit outside the playroom, providing security for her daughter, who found it difficult to separate from her. Gradually, I saw the small girl alone. She almost at once started to play with plasticine, making, with my help, figures of a mother and later a baby. She rent them to pieces while I communicate with her verbally with short phrases like mother broken. And these remarks were enough for her, I surmise, to think I understood her fears, for they set in motion quite complex activities. She would, for instance, run out of the playroom to where her mother was sitting after destroying the plasticine model of her, and then return to renew and develop her activities. When destroying the babies, she developed an intense interest in them, and her mother told me how she could not rest until she had looked into perambulators when out shopping with her. All I had to do was to make a safe, containing environment and use a process approximating to maternal reverie. The eventual result was most pleasing. The fits ceased, and from being a clinging infant, she became an independent and self-reliant little girl. This case is reported in more detail in New Developments of Analytical Psychology. I do not want to maintain that wrong attitudes and unresolved conflicts between parents and their children can be and often are decisive in the production of a child's distress and unresolved conflicts. I do not want to simplify an intricate problem, but to emphasize that it is no longer possible to make reliable generalizations so that each case has to be taken on its merits. Self-symbols. The next step I made might have been anticipated. In finding the fact that children can develop pathological symptoms as the result of their internal conflicts, and showing how a small child can work them out with minimal help, I began to recognize that a child is a discrete individual from very early on. It ought therefore to have been no surprise that self-symbols could be found in children's dreams, paintings, and especially finger paintings. And furthermore, that they were sometimes associated with ego growth in the sense that conscious and unconscious processes were active. But it was a frightening discovery, since only adult persons, especially in the second half of life, were supposed to develop such symbolism. It was especially fully fledged mandalas that struck me, and that they were the basis for developing pictures of the human body. There was also the fact that infants drew and small children scribbled circles. I found a baby of 1 year old who drew circles and then discovered the word I. After that, he stopped drawing the circles. The data which were not to be denied were in stark contrast with current ideas in analytical psychology about the self. They showed that the self could be represented very early on, and that the representations were related to ego growth. Whilst I was developing the ideas and making observations, I was bound to take into account the contention that the ego in childhood was fragmentary. There were said to be no more than islets of consciousness. That impression was gained from memories supplied by adults, but they were so much at variance with the number of purposive actions and responses of infants that some analysts came to assume an ego at birth. For my part, I consider that the organization of infantile behavior could best be understood as a sign of actions of the self, without, however, denying that an infant's ego may be more developed than had been supposed by Jung and his followers. Archetypes and maturation. I will now consider the nature of development in its archetypal aspects, having in mind that it would be fruitless to look for conscious fantasies. Here's Jung's model of the forms in which archetypal structures express themselves was especially relevant. He compared them to a spectrum. The unity of light can be divided up. At one end of the spectrum is the red color, and the other the violet. The red represented in mental imagery, emotional forms of expression. The blue, the spiritual forms. In addition, there were infrared and ultraviolet rays which do not find representation in colors. It is the infrared pole to which I want to pay particular attention. It may be thought of as the place where instincts function, but that is not much help because an instinct is not a developmental entity. It is furthermore too general and is often used to dismiss further inquiry in analytic circles. Bion, however, has developed a notation which I will now consider. It is specific and abstract, but useful inasmuch as it furthers description. The most primitive actions and interactions of an infant can be designated as beta elements. These can be acted on by alpha function, exhibited by the environmental mother, but also to some extent by the infant himself, and transformed into alpha elements. These elements can then be further transformed into dreams, myths, fantasies, and thoughts. Bion's model is valuable because of its capacity to reach into very early psychic processes in an infant, though it may be remembered that the elements can be inferred in later life, especially in the psychoses or in deep regressions. The elements represent extremely primitive actions and sense impressions, which seem to have a pattern that gives rise to the impression that the baby is having archetypal fantasies of a mature kind. An observer may then easily and erroneously come to that conclusion. The terms alpha and beta elements eradicate such faults by their abstract and neutral character. The notation is valuable also because it can replace the idea that an infant is in touch with anything like the collective unconscious, as envisaged by Jung, and provides an instrument for studying mother-infant interaction in all its complexity. It defines the infant's contribution and modifies the idea that an infant's life is dominated by his mother's unconscious. I am sometimes asked how early the infant experiences and acts in the elemental ways that I have indicated. It is tempting to say from birth, when direct observations can be made. But so much information has been accumulated using a number of well-attested methods about intrauterine life that they probably function before birth, say from 5 months gestation, when the brain is fully formed. One stands amazed at the amount of life that goes on in utero. Thumb sucking, drinking amniotic fluid, performing breathing exercises, turning and twisting, sometimes in beautiful spiral movements, responding to sounds and light from inside and outside his mother's body, etc. It is also well attested that he responds to his mother's emotional states, and thus knows about her before birth. A possibility which fits in well with his apparent capacity to respond realistically to his mother's emotional capacities after birth. So it is not surprising that once a baby is born, he begins to display many means of attaching himself and endearing himself to his mother, not to mention other characteristics which compel her to attend to his needs. Thus it becomes clear that the baby is born with an apparatus of objects, a mind of his own, as such, he adapts himself to his new environment. Actions of the self. The theory of the ego is unsatisfactory to account for all this. Could there not be a place for a theory of the self? I thought there was, so that an infant could be looked upon as a self in Jung's sense of transcending opposites. A fetus starts, therefore, from a primary unity in which consciousness and unconsciousness are not differentiated. I deduced that the primary state of an infant was as an integrated being, and that the integrator was the self and not the ego in the first place. That postulates involves a quandary, since I suppose that the unity had no means of relating to the environment, and it is obvious that the baby comes into relation with his mother even in utero. Once born, he relates to her, producing actions and making perceptions, as I have indicated. Pursuing the language of integration, we only had disintegration to go with it. I could not conceive that an infant at the breast was disintegrated, nor does observation suggest it. I therefore coined the term deintegration, to integrate the process by which the infant contributed to mother-infant interaction. A deintegrate maintained continuity with the main body of the self, thus leading to the accumulation of experience in motor action and sensory stimulation. Once the actions of the self has led to satisfaction, the self integrated again, sleep being the sign of that state. Such a conception of the self brings a new dimension to it, for it is now conceived as a dynamic structure through whose activity emotional and ego growth takes place. In infancy, the idea of the distinction conscious-unconscious has little use, and self-actions would not require such a dichotomy. Later on, however, the distinction takes place, so how can it have arisen? The best proposal I have met is Bion's idea of a contact barrier composed of alpha elements. That is a difficult notion to assimilate, but if consciousness is to arise, it must mean a barrier of some sort. The notion of repression is too sophisticated and applies to the warding off of conscious elements or dismissing conscious matter to the unconscious. A barrier of alpha elements is apt, since they are precursors of fantasies, dreams, of myths, all of which are elements having characteristics of consciousness. Preconceptions about infancy. The proposition I have enunciated may seem unwarrantably abstract. My case for working with them is the abstractions are sufficiently empty to to avoid obstructive preconceptions about infancy. The preconceptions are derived from drawing analogies about early development derived from complex and structured states of mind. This is called adultomorphic speculation. Since the abstraction would avoid false conclusions, they provide guidelines for further observations which will hopefully fill out so that the abstractions hopefully become embodied. The same procedure was followed in developing my ideas about the primary self and its capacity to integrate and deintegrate, which others than myself have found useful in organizing their findings and making new observations. I consider that my thesis requires change in a number of generalized preconceptions. They are: 1, that an infant is a part of his mother's unconsciousness, leading to states of fusion. 2, an infant is in a state of primary identity with his mother. 3, that events takes place in space between mother and infant. 4, that there is a primordial relation with the mother, different in nature from any other relationship. All these states are liable to be generalized so that a simplistic account of infancy is arrived at. Whilst they may be used as tools to describe or interpretation some observed states of mind, they have ceased to be of much use, since we now have much more refined conceptions with which to approach the study of mother-infant relationship. 5, that the mother is the carrier of the infant self, or mirrors it. This proposition is, from my position, theoretically impossible, and the observations of mother and infants do not give evidence of it. It appears to me that the authors of that conception are referring to projective identification of deintegrates of the self. 6, that part objects precede whole objects. 7, that there are well-defined stages defined as the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions. All these propositions have to be modified because a combination of theoretical and observational data that are derived from mother-infant observations. Now to consider the last two of these propositions, that part objects precede whole objects, and that the positions defined by Klein are well defined. That seems at first sight obvious, for an infant relates to a breast which is only part of his mother. Only later on does he come to know her as more than a breast, and eventually as a whole person, much as an adult knows her to be. That this may not be so, or rather that description is incomplete, is suggested by the proposition that it is through a deintegrate that a baby is brought into relation with a nipple. Supposing that the deintegrate is continuous with the main body of the self, his experience may at first have characteristics of wholeness. Furthermore, observing a baby in a feed, he is totally absorbed, as if there was nothing else but the breast, which consequently is his whole universe. Rather soon one has to include in that whole experiences the following sensations: tactile, auditory, visual, muscular, digestive, and respiratory. They are all to be conceived of part of his experience or wholeness. The whole object might then be compared with a mandala, with the nipple in the center and various objects placed within the magic circle. It is an analogy that is apt because it keeps in mind that the self has boundaries and can define not self objects. A baby may at once receive the breast, may latch onto it and start sucking, but it may not. Unfortunately, only in a few cases can reject it altogether. In between these extremes, there lie variable approaches by the baby and a variety of maneuvers on the part of the mother in initiating breastfeeding. Difficulties may be emotional, but it can be that the shape of the nipple is important, so that when corrected, the baby will feed without difficulty. So there is good evidence to support the notion that an infant can define not self-objects, a nipple and breast being objects of that type. The theory of part and whole objects is geographical and emotional. Assuming that the infant's first experiences of a whole object, gradually as his geographical knowledge increases, he will discover that there is a body of which a breast is only a part, and also that there are two breasts. The emotional part of the theory is of a different order and depends on the degree of pleasure and satisfaction or of frustration and pain that the breast can induce, and which the baby responds with rage and violence. It must be noted here that an infant's pain is not necessarily due to his mother's behavior, but can result from hunger that escalates into greed, which is not being satisfied because the breast, in all its beauty, is enjoying itself. It has been proposed that under the circumstances of an infant experience, circumstances, an infant experiences envy, though it is contested whether that is the right word to use for the experience of a very small infant. Good and bad objects. In this way, two classes of experiences are set up. One productive of love, gratitude, joy, bliss, etc., the other of pain, greed, violence, conflict, suffering, persecution, and misery. As part of his management of these contrasting experiences, the infant undergoes a particular deintegration. It leads to the definition of the breast as what one can call bad and another good. Both can be outside and represented in the real breast, or they can be reintegrated into the self. In consequence, we need to know how these experiences come about. There are two ideas which are useful, that of the container and the contained, and that of projective and introjective identification. They help in making sense of infant behavior and are complementary. Thus, the term projective identification refers to a mental content which is projected into another person or part of that person, who is consequently the container. So if the baby projects a bad breast into the real breast, he may refuse it altogether. He will experience the breast as attacking him. He then attacks back using mouth, nails, or excreta. A refusal may sometimes apply to one breast and not the other, so that he rejects one and accepts the other. If the bad breast is felt to be inside him, he will strive to get rid of it by screaming or evacuating it literally, by passing a stool or urinating, amongst other possibilities. These examples are only a few of the effects of the bad breast. All this I conceive to be the result of deintegration, because the dynamic events can be negotiated successfully by a mother and baby together and end happily in tranquility and sleep. Primitive identity. The descriptions I have just detailed correspond to Jung's concept of primitive identity, derived from the studies of anthropologists, especially Levi Brullo. psychotic patients, and analytic work with unconscious processes. It relies on the externalization, I use that term in preference to projection, of archetypal forms. That process is the basis for religious and magical practices, visions and theology. The essential element in that thesis is that identity between the internal psychic forms and the external world. In addition, there is a distinction between good and evil, gods, devils, and magicians. How and why all that arises is not gone into much. Klein, however, did just that, and detailed other mechanisms such as splitting and projective identification, resulting in the paranoid schizoid position. She since developed her propositions from pathological cases and from Freud, the notation, and from Freud. The notation has a psychopathological ring which is distasteful. It is true that Klein included normal splitting in her account, but that does not include the reintegration I hold occurs, and indeed usually predominates. Splitting I want to reserve for the more radical and permanent occasions in which reintegration does not take place. I have elaborated on this in a paper published in Chiron. I would recognize less dramatic forms of splitting than the one I described there, but would distinguish deintegration from them. The mother's beneficent actions. What does a mother do to bring about again and again a satisfactory outcome to the distressing persecutory and depressive states her baby gets into? I think that the most important one is she can act as container of her baby's emotional violence, digest it, and in various ways, mainly through maternal reverie, involving attention and good management, transform the bad breast into a good one. The baby will then introject it into himself and assimilate it to other good experiences that he has known before and will know again. Thus a mother can do much to mitigate her infant's pain. That cannot be avoided, however, and so it is vitally important that the infant's germinating inner world and his view of external objects will be sources of enjoyment which is soundly based. In this way he gets to a position at which he can confidently negotiate what will become her shadow. The depressive position. Melanie Klein developed another valuable description expanded into a proposition. It runs as follows. An infant gradually comes to realize that the two breasts of his mother are the same breast, which consequently is both good and bad. So when that he attacks the organ upon which his life and well-being depends, he recognizes that he has, in a delusional way, destroyed the good breast. Then follows a rather beautiful sequence. He pines and becomes absorbed in himself, so that he is inaccessible to his mother. After a variable and distressing time, he gradually recovers. He has reconstructed the good breast internally. He has, in short, accomplished a rather wonderful act of reparation. After this sequence, the baby's sense of reality takes a step forward and his mental life is enriched. The transformation is called the depressive position and is, in my view, the first step in individuation. A feature of Klein's exposition is that the positions persist throughout life. The importance of that is evident, and in analytic practice, the positions can convincingly be observed with some regularity, though contaminated with archetypal patterns. In the infant, observations conducted in London. It was therefore with much astonishment at the rather more small series of observations that the depressive position, DP, could not be observed. I hope that this is an artifact, for both Klein and Harris have been able to describe it. Nonetheless, it seems more accurate to recognize variable or mixed states as more frequent. That view of the matter has been adopted by Bion, who writes the state of affairs in a mixed form, PS to DP, with an arrow going in both directions between them. That depicts the mixture as well as the possibility of finding each position in pure culture. The theory of the primary self leads, as we have seen, to the inference that whole objects are primary at the start. So frustration would make pain and suffering having a depressive coloring, the baby whimpering or being miserable. Later, perhaps after a week or so, projective identification would make the paranoid schizoid position possible, followed by a secondary depressive position, fully possible as Klein maintains. Klein's views are thus, like Jung's, developmental. In this respect, the term position is enlightening. It is not conceived as a stage in development eventually to be given up. Each position is rather an achievement which persists throughout life as available modes of responding to circumstances to which they refer. In them are depicted rudimentary forms of the shadow, the anima, the animus, and the archetypal representations as a whole. To this I have added the self. Concept building. In Psychic Conflicts in a Child, Jung laid emphasis on the importance of concept building and thought in the child Anna, aged 3 years, as she investigated conflicts around the birth of her baby, a baby that took place. That is a highly original idea at the time, but though I thought about it, I could not develop it till Klein presented the idea of epistemophilic instinct. That explanation, based on an intense need to explore and get to know about the external environment and his internal world, was important. Explorations of the mother's breast, face, hair, chest, stomach, genital, excretory organs, above all the insides of her body, was paramount. It also leads to investigative sexual relations between parents, creating thoughts and fantasies about his own and his parents' bodies. His desire to enter into his mother's body leads to the development of loving approaches and violent attacks upon it, prompted by the need to know what is inside and to rob it of the father's penis, baby's feces, etc. Whether in imagination or action, the instinct for knowledge plays an essential part. That gives a very different account of infantile sexuality to the original one, in which the progressive development of drive theory from oral, anal to genital preoccupations takes place. It is not at all certain that any benefit results from calling the need for knowledge an instinct. What seems much more certain is that the need to know is linked with that of ascertaining the truth. But what is the truth? Is what the child is told to be by his parents to be so regarded, or is it what the child can appreciate? That is a complex question depending on the child's trust in his parents among other factors. The knowledge of intercourse is, of course, sometimes the result of observation, but mostly it is not, and the idea of it has to be developed by concept building and fantasy. So a child's truth may not be what he is told by parents. That can be taken as a likely story, and so not truly relevant. Data about the mother's pregnancy, by contrast, are much more accessible to observation. It is also necessary to take into account that all adult sexual activities are liable to evoke envy and jealousy at the child's often terrifying cruelty and sadism. Individuation. As a baby develops, he increases his motor skills and tolerates the absence of his mother increasingly well. He explores the environment. When doing that, he may depart and then come back for short periods, sit on his mother's lap and then depart again. Gradually, that becomes less and less frequent. He learns to walk, feed himself, and control his excreta. Then he has become a viable unity on a more sophisticated level. I envisage myself as initiating these changes and conceive that the infant shows further signs of individuation beyond its initiation in the depressive position. It is usual to think that the father now comes increasingly into the picture, but he has in reality always been in relation to his infant, and if he has not actually participated in the management, his wife takes masculine functions. Such an eventuality is not at all unsatisfactory, for small children do not differentiate much between a breast and a penis, and his experience of the breast may be of a phallic organ which squirts milk, often forcibly, into his mouth. Thus, archetypally, father is represented from the start. The sophisticated idea is today supported by the frequent presence of fathers who combine with their wives in the physical care of babies, thus making the transition from 2 to 3 body relationships smoother. The collective unconscious in infants. C. It is sometimes beheld that the infant is close to the collective unconscious and lives in a mythological world of limited extent. It is a view that has done much to stand in the way of studying infants and small children, so the proposition needs to be considered carefully. A myth is a sophisticated product compared with which an infant's fantasies are rudimentary and much more related to physical acts, even though myths also represent primitive mental processes, sometimes reaching down towards the body. They are also used as explanations of natural events in terms of deities and heroes, and of the solar and fertility myths and rites. In addition, myths are also used to predict the future. Astrology and mantic systems illustrate this, the I Ching being an especially good example. Finally, they have important social effects, especially revealed in the great religions of the world. Therefore, myths are far more extended and have a social and impersonal collective reference than an infant's or a small child's fantasies. They only have their analogies in the emotional life of a child. Jung made a sharp distinction between personal and collective psychology. It was a useful distinction to demarcate his position vis-à-vis Freud, and it is still useful in everyday life to distinguish group and family influences. And can it be applied to children? I have argued elsewhere that there are 2 different extant ways of using the term collective unconscious. The one is generic and covers the sum of archetypes. The other indicates social and cultural movements in society, not yet recognized as such. On the basis of the latter usage, Jung daringly defined the emergence of Wotan in the German regression that led to the rise and fall of Hitler. He also attributed changes in the unconscious that give rise to the assumption of the Virgin in Catholic dogma. That the theory of archetypes in its generic sense can be used to illuminate the emotional life of infants is, I hold, established, but the truly collective and social impact is only marginally relevant. That it expresses itself indirectly in techniques of childcare and education. Yet part objects are not personal, they are pre-personal. Good enough personal relations is primary and essential to infant and child development. It was extended nature of the unconscious which Jungians believed made analysis of children undesirable. A notion was stood in the way till I discovered that it was not true. The unconscious of a child is as limited as his structural environment, and he has to develop a long way before he can develop myth-like fantasies. All the same, children will enjoy fairy tales or stories, and nowadays television cartoons of unreal and often humorous figures. Sometimes they become absorbed in some story read to them or insist on its repetition over and over again. They have projected an unconscious element into it, and the story helps them to give form to their own emotion. Yet in spite of these difficulties, Freud invoked the myth of Oedipus to understand the experiences of a child in relation to his parents. When he had reached a full genital position at about the age of 5. That expressed the view that Oedipal conflicts are innate and would seek expression, never mind whether a real father was there or not. And Jung expressed the same idea when he claimed that the child's impulses and fantasies were myth-like. That has become generally accepted, though the origin of 3 body conflicts begin much earlier, even at the breast, which can have phallic characteristics as well as being nurturing, and so, in a sense, being 2 people. The primal scene. In this paper, I've made several references to evidence that individual takes place in infancy and childhood, and developed the thesis elsewhere. To summarize, I contend that the first step in that direction is evident in the development of the depressive anxiety exhibited by infants, culminating in the depressive position. There is further evidence in the increasing independence from mother and the eventual attainment of unit status. I will not rebate these and other accounts of the evidence I have collected, but will focus on one feature of an infant's life which seems to be significant. A central core of the individuation process is the conjunction. Is there any evidence that its archetypal pattern is active in infancy and childhood? At once the primal scenes springs to mind. The first formulation of that idea was made by Freud in his case studies. There he came across memories of his patient, the wolf man, witnessing sexual intercourse between his parents as a small child. Now it has become well understood that the primal scene is not only a witnessed event. Indeed, such an eventuality is probably rare, but it extends to almost any situation in which the parents are relating to each other in such a way that the infant is excluded. A form in which parents relate to each other is without doubt a vital matter to infants and small children, and it is especially their bodily relation which occupies them. In order to understand the child's conception, it is necessary to remember that each child has engaged in intimate lustful interchanges with his mother to the exclusion of all other members of the family, and that loss of that intimacy in weaning has been more or less stressful according to whether he has achieved the depressive position or not. That exclusive relationship to his mother has been more than breastfeeding. It extends to her whole bodily existence, including her excretory, genital life, skin, eyes, ears, etc. The intense need to know what parents do leads him to observe, draw conclusions, and make fantasies, so that what parents do together takes on a polymorphous character, which progresses till it gets to know the truth. But whether what he knows as the truth corresponds to adult truth is less important than the need to know through his emotional growth and his developing knowledge. Discovery of the real truth is furthered by pregnancy because observations can be made of changes in the shape of his mother's body. It is also furthered by the birth of the baby. An understanding of the libidinal nature of parental intercourse increases envy, jealousy, and feelings of abandonment. All may be very painful and lead to often terrifyingly violent attacks, especially on the mother's body and its contents, penises, feces, and babies, as Melanie Klein so brilliantly discovered. The intense period of interest and discovery eventually ends, and after a good enough solution of the Oedipal conflicts, a latency period ensues in which a child develops a more firmly structured mental life and can exert a different management of it. With it comes a greater sense of self represented in ego development, in which more importance is given to ideals, shame, guilt, and social life both inside and outside the family. Social adaptation. The first extra-family experiences of a small child is going to nursery school. One feature of that event is profoundly significant for our view of child development. A child that is sad or miserable for long after his mother leaves him at school will be attacked by the other children, who will dub him crybaby. The attack becomes greater if he actually cries. That description reveals the ruthlessness and intolerance of group mentality. It requires a regression from an aspect of individuation. For the new child is not allowed to work through his depressive anxieties by his peers and is forced back into the management of bad objects using persecutory and splitting mechanisms. I am reminding here of Jung's idea of individuation is only possible in its full sense in later life, where the demands of adaptation to collective and social life are being met. That requirement is illustrated by the example of the child going to nursery school and cry, but it is possible that the child will hope to preserve the sense of his own worth with friends at home or in secret. I am not considering those children to whom social adaptation is not much of a problem at all. The power of group psychology and its intolerance of grief and sadness is derived as it is from archetypal sources. It is nonetheless extremely great and continues throughout education. Its compelling force continues into social life continuously, though it may be well adapted too. Conclusion. In this essay, I hope to have demonstrated the nature of my investigations into the self in childhood. I ought really to have given a much full account of child development as exhibited in the unfolding of the self. That has not been sufficiently achieved, but I hope that what I have done will facilitate further work by myself and others. I am frequently reproached for being too psychoanalytic. I would answer that Melanie Klein and Bion are not truly Freudians anymore, just as I am not truly a Jungian. Nevertheless, Jung never reproached me for what I was doing, and he generously supported my work on synchronicity of the transference. Mrs. Jung was actively interested and supportive of my work with children, so I was encouraged to go on with it, in spite of the widely ambivalent attitude of most Jungians towards him, usually on methodological or doctrinaire grounds. I recognize that my essay presents a methodological issue, so I will state my position. I hold that anybody who provides evidence must be respected. Because of this, I have been able to assimilate Klein's evidence, which she richly provided. A joke that a child who produced certain data must have been reading Melanie Klein is not so ridiculous as it first appears. Klein was not a therapist of much weight. Theorist. Klein was, I must repeat that, Klein was not a theorist of much weight, but evidence convinced me almost at once. That is why, in the 1930s, I drew on what she told me, as this article indicates. Jung, in his Herrick-Lott lectures, said he was not interested in theories, but in facts. That is my position, with the addition that it is not relevant to who produced them. In a different context, it could be. And the theories are important if they lead to the discovery of new descriptions, facts, that Jung achieved, and so did Klein. They are my psychological mentors. It can be objective. How do you know when a discovery is a fact? It is a matter of observation and of experiences that cannot be contradicted effectively.